again, kind of at Korea TESOL, even though I'm in Ireland at the time. I've always really kind of enjoyed my experiences with the TESOL community from my time living in Korea. So it's great to be here and to introduce my team. So yeah, as Michael said, our discussion is entitled Technology and Language Assessment, Consequences and Considerations, to be precise. So before we begin, I'd just like to introduce our team very briefly and what we do. So we at the East Asia Assessment Solutions team, better known as EAST, it's much easier to say EAST. We work in a wide array of assessment-related areas in East Asia for the British Council. So for example, as well as running assessment workshops for teachers, we develop new assessment products for the British Council. So invariably, this relates to technology, which of course brings a range of considerations as well as challenges. So in this discussion, we'll hear from my colleagues in East about the work they've been doing in this area and what the key considerations and consequences have been. So finally, we'll bring it all together by considering the future of technology and language assessment, and we'll also emphasize what the consequences might be for teachers. Each of my colleagues will make a short presentation, around about 5 minutes, on their own research area before then handing over to the next presenter. So the first 40 minutes or so will consist of each of the presentations, and the next 40 to 45 minutes will be our discussion period, during which we will ask each other a variety of questions about the topics that have been discussed. We will give priority to the questions from the audience. So if you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to post them in the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can. And our own position at the British Council, I should make clear, is that we are very much in favour of the use of technology, but we must proceed with caution and encourage skepticism and ask questions throughout the developmental period of new tech products and services. Anyway, without further ado, I will introduce my colleague, Jonathan Dixon, who will kick off the discussion with a 5-minute presentation on doing summative assessment when there is no classroom. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Chris. I'll just share my screen now. Can everybody see that?
It is just loading up. Yeah, there we go.
Excellent. Okay, so hello, everyone. My name is Jonathan. I hope you're all having a lovely evening wherever you may be. As you all know, COVID-19 has disrupted the regular administration of classroom summative testing in schools around the world, forcing teachers to confront the challenge of finding a way, if any, of assessing their students remotely. This mini presentation aims to discuss potential methods that teachers can use to summatively assess language in the classroom when there is no classroom. Now, some of you may be asking yourselves, why not simply just cancel the end of year summative test? For this to happen, teachers need to evaluate whether the test is needed. So for example, if the test is quite low stakes, is a grade really needed? Would it not be better to just give comments and feedback to the students that highlight progress made in that given period of study? However, in my opinion, some form of assessment is still needed, as students and teachers both need to be reassured that learning has taken place in the school year. The form of that assessment is the teacher's decision based on many factors. Let's look at some of the options available to teachers now, looking at the pros and cons for each one. This is not an exhaustive list, just possibly the top 4 that I believe is happening at the moment in the world. One obvious method of remote assessment would be to use the existing paper and pencil test and conduct the test while students are at home. This could be done synchronously or asynchronously via email or through some kind of learning management system like Moodle. One major benefit of this procedure would be the relatively easy workload for the teachers in terms of test development. The existing test paper could be used, therefore no completely new test is needed. The test format would also be very familiar to students, which helps ensure there's no negative effect on their test performance. In terms of disadvantages, if the existing test covers a range of skills to be tested, it may be difficult to remotely assess using this method. You know, for example, if the original test had a listening section, could the audio clips be simply sent to students via email too? And if so, what would stop students from listening to the clips more than the prescribed amount? Another issue with this method is the potential for cheating. If a teacher cannot physically be there when a teacher is taking the test, how can the integrity of the test be maintained? Finally, there may be a negative effect on test performance due to non-standardized testing conditions. So for example, the student's environment, their bedroom or wherever, could be quite distracting. Another method of remote assessment involves the use of commercially available online tests. On the market today, there's a wide selection of language proficiency tests out there that can now be taken at home, including IELTS, TOEFL, Duolingo. Could teachers have their students simply take one of these proficiency tests instead? In terms of advantages, these tests are fully created and administered by the test providers, ensuring less work for teachers. The companies behind these tests often have many years of experience in designing and administrating tests, and they have the resources to ensure their tests remain of a high standard. Also, the possibility of cheating is slightly restricted as test items are rarely repeated and all tests contain some form of test security measures, some of which we'll talk about later this evening. However, there is one huge flaw when considering these kinds of tests, and that is the fact that they are not fit for purpose as an end-of-year summative achievement test. An achievement test should reflect the objectives of a particular course, and a general proficiency test is very unlikely to do this. It should also be noted that these kind of tests can be quite expensive and leads to the question, who would pay for this, the school or the students? A third method of assessing students remotely involves the teacher abandoning the use of traditional tests and creating new assessment tasks that are more appropriate for the new testing environment. So for example, instead of using a test that relies on multiple choice questions, why not create new assessment tasks that students may encounter in real world tasks, like loads of examples, setting up an online profile or collaborating on an online writing task. This method offers opportunities for teachers to test knowledge and skills in a more authentic and motivating way than regular tests. Also, if teachers are worried about cheating, they could create test tasks where cheating is actually allowed. For example, the use of an open book style task or a research essay where students are expected to quote their sources. This method also encourages teachers to innovate and be imaginative when considering new types of assessment. However, for that later point, many people could actually see this as a disadvantage, as teachers will need to work more to create brand new tasks, as well as create scoring rubrics to measure the quality of performances on these tasks. These new tasks would also be new to students, certainly to begin with, which may again be unfair in terms of test performance. The final method I'd like to introduce quickly, when a teacher feels like a test is no longer viable to assess their students remotely, the teacher can attempt to make a fair estimate of how their students have progressed and assign a grade themselves. However, to do this accurately, the teacher will need evidence to back up their claims. And one way to do this is to introduce portfolios or electronic portfolios into the classroom, a collection of students' work that demonstrates their progress and achievements over the year. Portfolios not only can provide an end-of-year grade for students, but also formative assessment by providing a structure for students to reflect over time on the learning process and to develop the skills that come from critical reflection. Portfolios also allow for a range of authentic language skills to be assessed, and a more accurate final grade than with a one-off test can provide. The incentive to cheat is also lowered due to less pressure from what a final test can certainly give. However, portfolios can be quite labor intensive for the teacher in terms of the creation of rubrics and the constant monitoring and scoring of students' work. It also takes time to inform the students about portfolios, what to include and how they are scored, which probably makes them unsuitable to replace a test in short notice. Today, I've introduced 4 ways to remotely assess your students. Going forward, I plan to do a bit more research in this area to better understand how teachers in East Asia have assessed their students remotely. So some of the possible research questions include these 4 here, which you are free to read. My ultimate aim will be to share my findings to teachers across the region in the hope that they can use this information to be better able at assessing language in the classroom when there is no classroom. That was quick. That brings us to the end of my presentation. I've been talking about the use of technology in classroom summative testing. I'm going to now pass you over to my colleague, Jan, who'll be talking about the use of technology in high stakes proficiency tests. Over to you, Jan.
Okay, hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Jan Langeslag. Let me quickly share my screen here and then we can kick off. All right, is everyone able to see my screen? Yes? Okay, excellent. So today I will be discussing very briefly some of the concerns that are that come up when we move a test from a paper-based to a computer-based delivery mode, and specifically IELTS. As you may know, since 2008, it is possible for test takers to sit IELTS on a computer. And naturally, this has led to several concerns among students, teachers, and other involved stakeholders, such as, is computer-based IELTS easier or more difficult than the traditional paper-based test? Do our teaching methods and our teaching materials perhaps need adjusting? But also, are certain groups of students perhaps disadvantaged because of the move to computer? These are all very valid concerns, really. And if we look at IELTS in particular at the surface level, well, the test is the same test as it always was. There's the same language skills being tested, the same item types are being used with the same topics or similar topics anyway. Also, the same rating criteria are being used by examiners. So at the surface level, there seems to be no problem whatsoever. But I bring up a couple of quotes here from the literature. Take about 10 seconds or so to have a look at them at your leisure. Mead and Drasgo, who have quite, an elaborately worded take on this, empirically established validity of inferences made from a paper and pencil speeder test should not be assumed to automatically generalize to a corresponding computerized test. MacDonald puts it quite a bit more succinctly when he says, now look, equivalence should not be assumed, but always needs to be demonstrated. So we cannot make any assumptions on the test being the same thing, even if it's at surface level the same test. When we move it to a different delivery platform, there could be little changes in what exactly we are testing. There will be different things influencing test outcomes that need to be researched. Research in this, validity research in this area needs to focus first and foremost on scoring equivalence. Are the scores similar of delivery? Do they discriminate at a comparable level? And is there any effect of computer familiarity or computer anxiety that is influencing students and the grades that they achieve? Now, research in this has been going on for about as long as there has been word processing. The oldest studies that I've seen there are from the 1980s. And the results are very, very mixed. Some studies will say computer-based testing leads to higher marks, others say it leads to lower marks, yet others say, oh, there's no difference at all. And these are very specific for the type of testing instrument and for the type of student test taker body that they use in their studies. So we need to keep doing studies for every specific test that we are seeking to validate with a number of students that reflect the students that will be sitting that exact test. Also, there needs to be attention paid to the equivalence of cognitive processes engaged, and awareness in this is a little bit more recent than points 1 and point 2. Why is this important? Especially if we've already established that scoring equivalence for a test is unchanged. Why then is there a need to still look into cognitive processes? Well, even if the scores are similar, if a test elicits different cognitive processes from a student, that means that the way by which they reach a certain grade is no longer the same. And the test can therefore no longer be said to be assessing the same construct, the same skills, which would mean that potentially a paper-based IELTS Band 7 would be different from a computer-based IELTS Band 7, which also would mean that the inferences and decisions made on the basis of those test scores perhaps would no longer be as valid as they once were. So these are all concerns that research needs to address. In 2017, there has been a study, an in-depth study done on the effects of the computer-based testing on IELTS in particular. Here you see it, you can access it for free, it's freely available. Here is some of the other bibliography that I've used in case you're interested. Now, Mr. Jan, how is this useful for us? How does this affect teachers and the way that we need to teach? That is something that I'm hoping to discuss with you later on after my colleagues' presentations. Thank you very much. I'll now be handing over to...
Thank you.
Yes, I'll be handing over to Chris.
Thanks very much, Jan. So the next presentation will be made by William Bayliss. So Will, over to you to talk about the roles for humans.
Jan, could you unshare your screen? It's not letting me share until you unshare your screen.
Yes, done. I stopped sharing.
Brilliant. Great. You should be able to see my screen.
Yep.
You can see it, fantastic. Hi everyone, thanks for the opportunity to talk today. This evening I will be talking about roles for humans in machine-rated assessment. The content of my presentation is based on my experience working in IELTS and the IELTS Smart Learning app. For those who aren't familiar with them, IELTS is a high-stakes English language proficiency test. And IELTS Smart Learning is an app with functionality that includes a placement test and a range of level-appropriate tasks which give the user instant feedback on their performance using artificial intelligence. Previous to my current role, I worked as an IELTS examiner and then later an examiner, trainer and manager. In my current role, I have managed examiners who produce the data that trains the artificial intelligence used by the IELTS Smart Learning app. And these examiners also help to validate the functionality of the app. Today, I want to chat about the differences I've observed in the roles of live rating for IELTS and rating as part of the training and validation of the ISL machine rater. This points to possible future roles for examiners as many tests move towards artificial intelligence. Before discussing this comparison in depth, I'd like to quickly explain what I mean by machine rater training and validation. As I said before, the ISL app has a placement test, and it also has tasks that use artificial intelligence to give feedback to the users. Recordings of the user are fed into the machine, and the machine gives the feedback automatically. Without guidance or training, the feedback given to the user can be and is most often weak. Well, how do we know this? Well, because we validate the feedback. For example, we look at the feedback given by the machine and we look for false negatives. This is where a user is told they've made a mistake when actually their usage was correct. To improve the feedback, what we do is feed the machine expert human ratings of the recordings. After this training, the feedback improves. How do we know? Because we validate the feedback. Regarding this process, the saying goes, garbage in, garbage out. What this means is we need to ensure the quality of the data being fed into the machine, because if that data is weak, then it's unlikely that the feedback will be improved. So now the comparison. Firstly, I'll describe the role of examiners for IELTS. A normal IELTS examiner will have a very high volume of a very narrow range of tasks. For example, they may just rate the writing and the speaking module. Because of this, they have a very specialized skill set because they are focused just on these two modules. All of the standards and documentation of IELTS are set by Cambridge. They're set by a governing body. The examiners are given regular feedback with scrutiny like standardization coming at regular intervals, and also feedback may be triggered if there are any performance issues from the examiners. This contrasts with rating as part of the training and validation of a machine rater. These examiners will rate a much smaller volume of tasks, but it's much more technical and much more specialized work. For example, the focus may be just solely on outliers, or they may focus on just the validation of the output of the app. The process of machine rated development is generally iterative. So this means that the standards and documentation aren't provided by a governing body, and the scope of the tests that are being rated can often be revised. This means that the examiners need a really wide experience, they need a lot of expertise, and they need deep assessment literacy. There may be no right answers. And as I said, there's no governing body that sets the standard. The raters are actually under more scrutiny than those for a high stakes test like IELTS. For example, every rating that the examiner gives may be scrutinized. When it's needed, standardization will happen. Not just regularly, but whenever it's needed. And also the rating scales, the rubrics may be revised if needed. As I said, ISL, IELTS Smart Learning, has a wide range of tasks. Each of these different tasks may have a different rubric, and the raters may be rating all of those streams at the same time. This means that the examiners need a higher level of EQ and they need a high level of expertise. Machines have weak spots. For example, the candidates consciously trying to game the system. And I think Trevor, who's speaking after me, is going to talk about this in a lot more detail. So looking towards the future, there's a possible future where machines and humans work together. There's a possibility that the humans may rate the tricky outliers, the tricky performances, and the bulk of the tests may be rated by the machine. That's all from me. Thanks very much. Now over to Trevor.
Thanks, Jan. Or Will even, sorry. Thanks, Will. Yes, so basically Will was talking about how we can train machines. And I'm going to talk about how kind of we can't, because machines and humans will always rate in different ways and measure different things. So bear with me as I share a screen. So can we see this?
Yeah.
Okay. So if we've got a difference between a human-rated test and a machine-rated test, then effectively we can cheat in a different way as well. And while there's been a lot of research done on how to cheat a traditional test and how to stop that cheating, there is a lot less research done on how we can cheat a machine and what the machine can do about it. So very briefly, I'm going to talk about that. And before I do, I just wanted to give maybe some examples of test-taking strategies, not necessarily cheats, but strategies for maybe improving scores. Maybe in 20 seconds, can I just ask you to have a look at these and decide maybe which ones are positive for the learning experience and maybe which ones are not. So maybe just 10 seconds or so. Okay, so a possible answer then. Let's start on the left with positive washback. What do we mean by positive washback then? So it's when a test-taking strategy, something that we do to prepare for a test, affects what we do in the classroom or what we do in English learning in a positive way. So it washes back in a very positive way. So for example, if you practice with peers, then arguably you've got opportunities to simulate a test, but also you're practicing your interaction, you're practicing other parts of speaking. So it's very positive, not just for the test. Negative washback is the opposite. So for example, if you're memorizing a model answer, then okay, maybe that will help you with one question in a test, but you're spending time on something that won't necessarily help you when you go abroad, study at university. It may inflate your score. This is an example of negative washback, which again is the sort of behavior we don't want to see in a classroom. And often when we try and cheat the machine or break the machine scoring systems, we end up with inflated scores, but using behavior which are examples of negative washback. To explore this further, we need to look at the differences between what a machine can rate and what a human can rate. And here's just a very, very simple example. If we look at the left, you can see 4 categories. This comes from the IELTS test, so fluency, lexical resource, grammar, pronunciation. The descriptors will come from the public band descriptors that are available to everyone. I've just chosen a couple of examples for each of the traits, like fluency or grammar. So for example, a human is interested in terms of lexical resource in the ability to discuss different topics and the precision used in that discussion of a topic. For pronunciation, we're interested in a range of features, but also on the impact on the learner. How hard is it to listen to? So we've got quite a lot of range. There's a lot of judgments that are made in a human rating system. When we go to the machine, it's about the numbers. A machine counts, and it can count lots of things that are useful to us as designers of tests, but it doesn't necessarily cover everything. Let's have a look, for example, a lexical resource. So here we can count what we call unique word count. So that is the number of different words you use, but it doesn't necessarily measure how well we use them. In the same way, the machine may tell you if you're using a technical or a less common word based on the CFR level of that word. But again, it's not telling you whether you're using it well in context, whether it's appropriate. And if we look at pronunciation, we can see that maybe it can measure things like phonemic accuracy, word stress, but can it measure things like sentence stress, rhythm, using features of pronunciation for emphasis? So there's differences here. So when we go on to talk about cheating then, what advice is given to test takers to cheat? The things you're about to see come from websites that train people to get better scores on automated tests. So if we look, for example, at fluency, you speak faster, you avoid hesitations because they are the things that the machine can measure. There's a question on whether that is natural. We hesitate naturally, we pause for emphasis. So arguably this is an example of negative washback as well. Let's think about lexical resource then. So if we're talking about technical words, then maybe we're using words that are higher than our level, our proficiency, and maybe we're using them inappropriately, but you might still get higher scores. And finally, pronunciation then. So here we're saying we can measure word at the word level, what we call the segmental level features of pronunciation. So if you speak very clearly and enunciate each word, maybe the machine really likes this. However, we're destroying other features of pronunciation like rhythm and sentence stress. So again, inflated scores, negative washback. What do we need to do about this as an industry then? A few quick points. First of all, we want to know more about what happens when a student tries to cheat a machine. And at the British Council, we are currently doing research on this to explore exactly what strategies can affect what scores. Secondly, we need to look at the filters and work with tech companies to find out how they identify cheating and are they able to effectively screen and penalize students that are cheating in this way. Not just that, we need to share this information with basically the teaching industry, with students, so they know if they try and cheat, it won't help them. And finally, and this is most important, we need to increase the number of features that auto raters can measure so that actually we're trying to really emulate the human rater and students will be preparing more effectively for tests and measured on that improvement that they achieve. Thank you very much. I'm now passing on to Cheryl Cook, who will be talking more about the concerns of auto raters, maybe in a more global context. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Great, and you can see my screen, yeah. Can you see my, okay, great, thank you for the thumbs up there. Great, well, thank you for the opportunity to speak and to address CoTESOL. My presentation is around the implications of automated assessment on English as a lingua franca. And in my presentation, which thematically is very much linked to what Trevor has just mentioned, and we'll pick up and touch on some points that will be picked up by some of my colleagues in the subsequent presentations. It's about the, and I'm going to be looking at what English as a lingua franca is, so we've got a clear definition of that, and then looking at how automated assessment works, very, very briefly, very superficial overview, and how these two things come together, but specifically what we should be looking out for and considering at this particular time. So one of language assessment's most famous practitioners, Professor Tim McNamara, in a 2014 article used the phrase that language testing is at a moment of crisis. And he mentioned this for two particular reasons. One is because of technological advances, and many of us are experiencing that right now, being part of the new way of working and working remotely. But the other is something that's been with us for quite a while, and it's around socio-linguistic factors. And specifically in this article, Professor McNamara mentioned that the way that English is being used nowadays by various different people and the advent of English as a lingua franca. So these two things are coming together, and it's we can go several different ways, and it's extremely important that we consider very carefully the consequences of what we choose to do at this point. So just very briefly looking at English as a lingua franca, what is it? Often known by the and you might be familiar with the categories of dividing up the English or English use around the world. That was sort of started in the 1980s by Cattrew. Inner circle, outer circle, and expanding circle English. Inner circle being native speaker varieties. Native speaker itself being a little bit contentious and difficult to define. World English is where it's been nativized, encoded, and is strongly associated with identities. So for example, Singaporean English, Indian English, Jamaican English, just to give you a very, very few examples. And then finally, English as an international language. And traditionally, 30, 40 years ago, it was really people around the world learning English in order to communicate with native speakers. And so measurement and assessment was in relation to native speaker norms. But many things, or several factors, have actually moved us in a different direction. And in particular, technology-enabled communication, being able to speak to people across the world at any point, has changed what English is used for and who it's used by. And as well as the increased international contact over the last particularly couple of decades. And so what we're seeing is communities of practice that are using English primarily as a tool for communication, people who are not communicating with native speakers particularly. And so this has led to, in particular, one of the researchers, Seidelhofer, and many of you might be familiar with her work because she works very much in applied linguistics and language teaching around ELF and English as an international language. And she has put forth an argument for a re-evaluation of what defines English for the majority of users. So if we look at circles, we still see, of course, the native speaker varieties, the world Englishes, but we're seeing these communities of practice, whether it be around professions, whether around interests, but these extend across all the different circles and may not include native speakers at all. And so we're looking at English as a lingua franca, where it's a mutually comprehensible mode of communication. There will be negotiated meaning, shared ownership of it. It no longer belongs to the inner circle. And it's very much focused, perhaps around a common core, but very much focused around comprehensibility. And I prefer the word comprehensibility as I go further in this discussion to intelligibility, but we'll see that they're often used interchangeably. So very briefly, moving on to how this has changed. So what we saw perhaps 50 years ago, 40, even 30 years ago, was this real sort of prioritizing of native speaker norms in language assessment. Shifting towards a focus on comprehensibility. And if you examine or if you use tests in the classroom or if you do practice tests at all, you may have noticed quite a lot of reference to either comprehensibility or intelligibility in various different language tests. In IELTS, we see in the band descriptors reference to things like easy to understand, which is the definition of comprehensibility is ease of understanding, and intelligible or unintelligible clarity. So it's very much around this idea of being able to understand someone in comprehensibility. So moved in that direction. I don't think any tests are sort of fully focused on comprehensibility, but certainly there's been a movement in that direction. TOEFL IBT, another example where intelligibility is used quite a lot, and really, to be honest, they mean comprehensibility, they're interchangeable here. And this focus on communication of the message. The CEFR, which is not a test, but the Common European Framework of Reference, explicitly mentions this move from focusing on form, focusing on accent and accuracy of pronunciation in relation to a native speaker norm, to moving towards intelligibility. And I find it interesting that they mention that it has not focusing on intelligibility previously has been detrimental to the development of teaching pronunciation. So we've seen what I view as a very positive move, where people can focus on being understood rather than trying to achieve an idealized, impossible native speaker norm. However, automated assessment is threatening that. And this is where we need to be particularly vigilant at the moment. Why is it threatening it? Trevor might have touched on some of these points, as did Will in his presentation. But really, in order to use machines to assess spoken language, we need the machines to be able to learn to do what human raters do. And in order to do that, we need specific reference points. So often many of the machines, as I'll show you in the next slide, might use a particular pronunciation dictionary. It may be just one variety of English. It may include various varieties of English, but more often than not, it's fairly limited. But big data, and there are issues around data because we really need to consider what data set we're using. You might know or have heard of Timnit Gebru, who until fairly recently worked for Google. And she, this is from the article that her and several other professionals in this area of data science and big data and machine learning wanted to publish, and it is out there, obviously. But she cautions against data sets and was really pushing for us understanding data sets and sampling much more responsibly. So key points there: the characteristics of these data sets will fundamentally influence a model's behavior. You might have heard the term rubbish in, rubbish out, and that's exactly what can happen if we simply draw on huge data sets without understanding whether they're representative of the people that we're trying to apply these models to, without understanding whether there are biases in these data sets. And they can have severe consequences for people. So just a little bit more on automated assessment. So machine rating, many of the current rating systems, automated rating systems for English language assessment, will need to have an acoustic and language modeling system. And it's often based, not always, but very often based on a particular variety of native speaker speech. The raters are not representative of the real world users either. They're typically examiners who are typically either native speakers or very close to being native speakers as part of the recruitment criteria. So they don't really represent someone else who might be listening to the speaker. In fact, it's most likely not to be a native speaker in real world English use. The samples that are used to feed into the machine, the audio samples, are many times just from a limited range of first languages, and that can really affect the data set as well. It can affect how the machine learns to assess someone. The pronunciation dictionaries, as I've mainly based on native speaker varieties. There have already, there are clear examples of how data sets have discriminated and had serious consequences for people, not only in terms of language learning, but in other areas as well. And one of the most widely reported is around facial recognition, where the machine is learning to recognize pictures and faces in real life based on whatever samples are being fed into the system. And typically those samples are not representative of certainly of the ethnic and racial makeup of a particular population. And so, as we can see in this article, which was in The Guardian, and I'll put up the list of references later, that software made in East Asia is better at identifying East Asian faces. So you cannot just transplant that to a different part of the world. And it really is about what the machines have learned on. This highlighted their tech teams need to think about how they are training their artificial intelligence, and they need to take into consideration who the user community is. There's an article in the MIT Technology Review that points to the unscrutable models, because quite often, there are various different models, but quite often we don't really know what's going on. The data goes into the machine uses algorithms and looks for patterns in order to replicate what the humans do, but we don't necessarily know. Quite often we don't know, neither do the development teams, what the machine is really doing. And there's a very pertinent example of an automated English language test where an Irish veterinarian who spent several years in Australia working and was looking to get permanent residency failed the English test, or didn't get the score that she needed, despite being a highly educated native speaker of English. And having lived in Australia and functioned perfectly there for a number of years. So, there are issues around this, and there are issues around data collection and data sampling that we need to consider. So we can see that we could be in a situation where we're moving from focusing on an ability to communicate, on comprehensibility or intelligibility, on acceptance of very many varieties, as long as the meaning is clear, to this more dangerous situation where we're almost going back to this nativeness. The machine is looking to hear whether you sound like a particular native speaker, and we're looking at accentedness, and again, the privileging of the native speaker when the native speaker is not part of most conversations that happen in English at a global level. So it does sound like doom and gloom, but it is actually, yes, a moment of crisis, but also a moment of opportunity. And this is certainly where we need to do something, where we need to lobby, where we need to talk about this. And we need to proceed with careful consideration of the consequences of bringing automated assessment into language assessment. We need to make informed decisions. We need to understand the evidence. We need to understand what is going on in automated assessment. And we need to be inclusive in the data sets and the data that we use. It needs to be representative of the English language users around the world. We need to ask questions around what are we encoding? Are we encoding bias if we're only using native speakers to rate the data? What are we doing? Are we encoding these particular biases? We need to ask whether there's a focus on communicative ability rather than just surface level traits. For example, Will spoke about gaming the system. If we simply speak faster, are we going to get a better score, even if it doesn't have a positive impact on communication? I mentioned the data representative of English language Franca users and how important that is. And also that raters need to be representative, not only of the speakers, but also of ELF listeners as well. So great opportunity for us as assessors and as teachers. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you very much. So now we have Jonathan coming on, Jonathan Cruz.
Yeah, can I have the screen sharing option?
Sure, trying to stop sharing. I'm not sure how to do that. Oh, there we go. Stop share. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody. Hi, everyone. Okay, I'm just basically going to share now, and if I can't get it to share, I'll ask Chris to do it, because this is a new computer of mine. So I'm having problems with it. So
yeah, just let me know. I can I can share yours if needs be.
Okay, yeah, can you do that?
Okay, just a second, or just maybe 10 seconds. Hold on now.
Okay.
And you can just tell me to move the slides on. I need it. Okay.
Yes, please. Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right. Bear with me there. Okay. So, Jonathan, you can see yours here, can you?
Just a second. I think so. That's great. Yeah. Thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate that. I got a new Mac and I have no idea how to use it.
No, just tell me when to. Just tell me when to move it on.
Okay. Okay. Sure. Okay. So basically, thanks very much, Cheryl, for passing that on, and thanks very much, Chris, for you helping me with my technological issues, and quite pertinent in terms of the fact that we are talking about consequences of technology in testing. My actual talk is about is a move away from data sets and the issues of bias when feeding the machine, to going back to sort of test development and thinking of test consequences when you're when in the light of this new automated testing revolution. So I've got here a very belligerent question: what is this picture about? And the need for visual literacy in automated testing. In other words, considering what images we should be using in test development going forward with automated assessment. Chris, if you'd like to click onto the next slide, that'd be great.
Mm-hmm.
Have you clicked on?
Yeah, yeah. You should be able to see the next slide now.
Okay. So basically, why does it matter about visuals, images in tests, which are essentially, language tests anyway, verbal or textual medium? Some time ago, 2019, I did a survey with a number of students. I think it was about 200 or so. I was lucky enough to get so many because of the school that we had relationships with the British Council. And some of the responses, well, generally the responses were about, in terms of positivity about visuals with tests, is that, you were able to, there was the use of images made things clearer in conjunction with test questions, or easy to understand, or actually, the test made the test more interesting or attractive. Those are the general comments. Basically, that seems enough for a lot of test developers in terms of why they use images, in terms of fitting with certain questions as well that people use to say, can you describe the picture, and or what are the people doing? So basically, with speaking tests or writing tests, this is something that people use. So any image, as long as it's clear and looks fairly nice, will do. But moving on there, Chris, to the next slide, if you don't mind.
Should see it now.
Okay, yeah, a bit of a delay because you're in Cork and I'm in Shanghai, so I don't know why. But anyway, so there's a surprising amount of research in visual literacy in testing. It's not an under-researched area field, but it's certainly not, massively researched as particular. And so really, we've got a series of important studies. One of them, Suvorov here, Ruslan Suvorov, is probably one of the leading experts in eye tracking, and he did a multimedia test in visuals, how they work in conjunction with tests, particularly with videos. And eye tracking essentially just you show where the test taker is looking or fixating on a particular test to see how they're responding to the images and the test questions. So it's called fixation levels. But if we move on to the next slide, apart from what was a very interesting study in terms of test taker behavior, Suvorov, and this is something that basically drew my attention, was the emic or emic perspective. I announced that. Emic perspectives means sort of the cultural the cultural reference points you have inside you. It's the insider approach, really, understanding what cultural reference points or what particular so societal reference points you have in order to make sense of the, and particularly the images or the literature you're interpreting. So moving on from, and Ruslan basically is now actually, I think he's in Ontario, Canada. That's where he's, this was a study he did with the British Council, but he was with the University of Hawaii at the time, and that study is still there. But now he's in Ontario if you want to see him, but let's move on. And so this is a definition of basically emic understanding. It's the insider approach. And Hooper and Grinnell also pointed out that basically, if you just click on it once again there, Chris. Sorry for this, yeah. Can you click on again? Oh yeah, okay, you'll see this picture of this looking at King Kong and the Empire State Building, which is holding aloft on his shoulder. I don't know if you've ever seen the film King Kong. I mean, a lot of people have, but a lot of people haven't. In terms of the joke of the Empire State Building being the smaller point there, which King Kong is carrying, would probably be sort of funny to some people, but this kid doesn't get it because he's never seen and he doesn't understand King Kong. That's a shifting point of cultural reference. It's cultural reference he doesn't understand. If you don't understand something or you don't have a familiarity with it immediately in a test, it leads to ambiguity. Ambiguity in terms of what the question's asking and how that fits or contiguously fits with the image you want to use as input. Now this is a problem, and it's not just a problem for test takers, but it's a problem for the machines you feed in terms of training data. If you can just click on again there, Chris. Sorry, I'm really going to get a hang of my Mac Pro next time. So Silverhoff, as I said, mentioned that basically interpretation is manifold, and this is backed up by Cronbach. If you are in testing, or you're obviously very familiar with Cronbach and Meal and Cronbach Alpha and all those kind of things. But he stated that basically any sort of interaction between different types of input, and he said this in 1975, creates a hall of mirrors that extends to infinity. Essentially, subjectivity leads to massive amounts of interpretation. So we have to be very careful about how we consider what we use, not just in terms of tested question development, but also image development. We can just move on again there, please, Chris. Now, there was a study this led me on to reading about a study that happened in terms of test consequences and bias when feeding machines. And this study was done by Dr. Margaret Mitchell, and you can find it online. It's very easy to find if you Google it. It's a bias in the vision and language of artificial intelligence. And you can see there's a huge amount of bias. And as Cheryl mentioned, in terms of basically being very careful about what is assumed when inputting test data, particularly from a cultural perspective, that you don't want to get too culturally specific. Same with images as well. And this is something that's been causing a huge amount of ethical concern, because it's something that's not really being considered enough or actually being skirted over. And of course, I don't know if you've read about this, but Dr. Mitchell has actually been fired from Google. Now, why? I have no idea, but it's unfortunate that ethical conversations are not being held at the moment. If you just sort of click on a bit more, Chris. Now, this weird looking character, it was me, and this is not just a moment of self-aggrandizement. Well, it is, but it's basically, I just want to show that once we were all kind of, nice looking when we were kids, I sort of went to that area. But if you just look at this nightmare of 70s fashion and then click on, don't click on yet, Chris, please. Okay, now a contiguous question to this image is, who am I related to? Have a think about that for a second. And, I'll give you a clue. Three people in this picture. You wouldn't get a clue in a test. Okay, now if you said the first person, if you can click on that there, would be maybe the girl with the curly hair. Yes, that's my middle sister. Angela, and you might have realized that there's a connection genetically between the curls and the face shape and some of the eyes, but yes, that's my middle sister. And then you may think I might be the blonde person, you might assume because of the blonde hair, but no, actually, Chris clicked on, preempted me, but that's okay, it's right to do so. And that's my eldest sister, Shirley, who's got the eyes, but I've got black hair. So you may not have assumed that, but that is not the end to this particular intended question's answer. If you click on again there, Chris. I'm related to myself. That's me as a kid. But in terms of ambiguity of purpose or test question clarity, 2 of those answers could have been right, or all 3. But the point is that you have to be very careful in terms of considering ambiguity and question formation contiguous to images. Moving on. Here is another moment of self-aggrandizement when I basically drew a picture about 4 or 5 years ago using an old iPad what I was trying to do was show a very sort of pensive moment of a young man being inspired by looking out over a scenery of a town, a vista. I think I was trying to get perspective right. I failed abysmally. But everybody that sees this doesn't think this is a moment of quiet reflection or on a vista. Most people, and I'm sure you feel the same, feel it's kind of like a very depressing picture of a person about to jump, contemplating suicide. That was not my intention at all. But the thing is that what is intended in terms of test development, images and questions is not always the same as what is perceived by either the test taker or the person viewing. And that's where innate bias comes in a lot of the time, not just from the test taker, but basically from the people developing the test. So it's something that conversation needs to be had. And we talked about consideration, and consideration is very important. If we just click on. Now, there is a book called Visual Literacy, which I'll show you in a minute. It's part of the slide. But the Canadian Common Curriculum Framework on Active Viewership, and I've put image there, but basically most of the time it talks about text. It says that you need to ask these questions when considering using images in tests, not just tests, but teaching material. And these images are, for example, what is the test representing? How is the image constructed? What assumptions or interests, beliefs and biases are portrayed by the image? What's the purpose of the image, and etc. What is the reaction to the text? What causes the reaction, and what personal connection? So we're looking at emic issues as well there, and as well as etic actually. But these questions do need to be asked, and we do need to sort of understand the need for diversity and trying to be inclusive in terms of image creation, and also genre image, which I'll be looking at. Choices of genre that you use and how that affects the test taker. So these are all effective factors that have to be put into place when you're creating tests, but also when people come to use tests for automated assessment. Okay, Chris, nearly done. If you just click on. And this is the book where the Canadian framework was taken from. This is a very good book for visual literacy for as well as test takers. And there's another one there. Can you just go back to the previous one there? This is a collection of, I would say, groundbreaking articles about visual literacy. And then moving on, this is for people that basically want to understand the meta language and behind sequential art, but also understanding what is the subtext of images. So we have the image in English language teaching, and then the next one is understanding comics, which sounds childish, but basically is a great discourse on critical understanding of images. So thanks very much. Thank you very much, Chris, for helping me out there. Appreciate that. And over to now Neil Ryder, who will be talking about effective factors.
Right, thanks. Just a second, let me just do a screen share here. All right. Hi, so I'm just going to talk briefly here. See, we're going a little bit over the time we scheduled. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the effective factors that have an impact on test takers who are doing remote speaking assessments. So here we're talking about VCS, which is the IELTS speaking test being done by a video link, rather like doing a Zoom call like what we're doing right now. So VCS stands for video call speaking. And this is something that's been in development for some time, but because of the events of the past year, it's always been pushed to be something that we're going to prioritize. And it's ended up, I think it was launched about the middle of last year, and it's been expanding, at least in China, since then. The early indications from the feedback we've got from students who've done the test by video is that they find the experience to be positive so far. I mean, it's basically the same test. It's the exact same test materials as the traditional face-to-face IELTS speaking test. And they found that technical issues were very rare. So one of the fears we had, of course, is just with issues to do with maintaining a steady connection and audio and the quality of the video. That hasn't really been a problem. Very occasionally it has, but that was an issue. What we found, though, is that the test delivery, of the way the examiner delivers a test, seems to be somewhat more standardized than in the tests that are being done face-to-face. There's probably some different reasons for that, but obviously, when it's being done on video, the examiner knows that every single session is being recorded. So the examiners are more self-conscious about this sort of the way they're coming across to the candidate. They tend to moderate their for example, if they feel irritated, they'll show it less because they know for sure it's going to be recorded. So traditionally with a face-to-face test, there's only an audio recording that's used for monitoring basically the test procedures and the scoring. But now it's like a full customer service experience. So the examiners are kind of adapting to that. And regardless of the personalities of the examiners, they're all kind of producing much more standardized test experience. So the examiners have to be more conscious of things like eye contact and their posture and their body language. Normally, when you're doing these, like any sort of conversation on a video link, it's quite difficult to remember to actually look at where the camera is and not to look at yourself or to look at the text that you're reading. So examiners now are under more pressure in the way they're monitored to kind of take that into account and try to maintain eye contact with the test taker. And again, with the posture and body language, they have to make sure they stay within the center of the frame. So in a face-to-face test, you may have people leaning way back and kind of all over the place, depending on what time of day it is. And if it's just after lunch, the examiner might be, more horizontal than they would be at the beginning of the day. But because there's only the small area that their head has to stay in on the camera, that the examiners, they may find this more stressful, but it does produce a kind of a more professional and consistent experience for the test taker. It's also important for the examiner to avoid verbal back channeling. So if what we find in a video test is if the examiner says things like, yeah, the test taker will stop thinking that the examiner is about to actually take a full turn. When it's done face-to-face, the examiners can kind of in the background, and the test taker will keep talking because they'll recognize that it's just this sort of verbal nod. So examiners have to be more careful about not really making any noise until they actually intend to make an actual interruption. But it is important for the examiner to demonstrate active listening. So instead, they're expected, besides the eye contact, they also are expected to do a lot more nodding, and even slightly exaggerated nodding and smiling, maybe even if the jokes aren't funny, but there has to be this sort of a showing that there is some connection between what the candidate is saying and the response of the examiner, so the candidate knows the examiner is actually, like the audio stream is working, the examiner is actually hearing what they're saying. Now, from the test taker's point of view, this changes their experience from a face-to-face test. What we found is that the candidates often have longer turns than they would in a face-to-face test because the examiners are interrupting less. So the examiners are interrupting less because of what I just said in the previous slide. This means the test takers also seem to be less visibly nervous because they're more just concentrating on their own long turns, their own production of speech. They're less worried about things that the examiner might be doing. They're less distracted also by the examiners maybe having, maybe not necessarily intentionally seeming aggressive, but maybe seeming unfriendly or too serious or that. They also aren't going to be distracted by things that happen in the room. So like noisy air conditioners or mosquitoes, or just things like handing the pad and paper and the book back, and sometimes the pen drops and then they've got to pick it up off the floor, and there's all this panic about, oh, the examiner's going to be angry now. So with all these other things that might happen not being in consideration, test takers have reported afterwards that if they felt nervous about it, they found it a less nerve-wracking experience than face-to-face in general. So less stressful experience for students who maybe feel uncomfortable about the test. But on the other hand, some people did report that the interaction feels less natural. Now, this is because it tends to be more of a sort of a strict question, answer, rather than this sort of conversation that can develop in IELTS, especially in part 3, where a stronger student who feels comfortable speaking with an examiner and an examiner who's in a good mood, they can build a sort of rapport and engage in kind of friendly conversation that the test takers will enjoy. When it's done on video, obviously there's less of a chance for having that kind of positive engagement. But one thing I should add here is when it says it feels less natural, actually much of the conversations we've had in the past year have been by video. So there's not necessarily anything that's unnatural about speaking to people on video. It's a new way of speaking that's becoming more common, and it changes the way the test feels slightly, but we don't necessarily have to feel that that's a negative thing. It's just a different way of learning how to interact with people. As for teachers, they have to think about, if they're preparing students for a video speaking test, they might want to think about how they can mitigate that and make their students feel more comfortable about talking by video. So for the impact for teachers, there is no observable impact on test takers' scores depending on which version they've done. So the validation studies that were done before the launch of the VCS had shown that it didn't really matter from candidate to candidate, no matter who the examiner was, they're still scoring the same score, a 5.5 face-to-face, and then a week later would still get a 5.5 doing it by VCS, and vice versa if they do the video one first and then the face-to-face test. So there may be rumors that one is easier than the other, but that's more about the idea of, is it the effective factors make you feel more or less comfortable. It doesn't actually affect the way the examiner scores a candidate. Tech literacy is not an issue with VCS because basically they're brought into a room in a test center, they're put down and the camera is on and they go. They don't need to know how to navigate a platform for the speaking component of it. So that doesn't really matter if the students are younger or they're very old and they're not comfortable with computers and that, like anybody could do it. But if they're doing a full CDI test with the reading, listening, and writing components as well, then tech literacy could be a bit more of an issue because those components require some navigation skills. Students who have a particular anxiety about speaking tests may prefer VCS for the reasons I mentioned. So for teachers, maybe it's up to the teachers to try to kind of gauge what kind of experience their students would prefer. And if their students are trying to choose between the two, being able to give them advice about how the experiences are different and then different things they have to keep in mind before they go into that. But most of the preparation for this is still going to be preparation just for improving a student's speaking. There's no really special tricks to hack the VCS test to get a better score. Teachers need to be able to help their students decide which version of the test they prefer to take. Really, that's the final point there, just summarized. And VCS is going to supplement the face-to-face testing, but it will not replace it. So the intention of VCS to continue to grow, at least in China for now, and presumably in more and more locations worldwide. But there's also the intention to maintain having face-to-face testing as well. So I think that's all we've got for the time here. What I'm going to do now is hand over to my colleague Radost, who's going to talk a little bit more about the test security for remote assessment and issues to do with remote proctoring. So I think I'll hand over to her now.
Thanks, Neil. Okay. assuming everyone can see this.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for making it to the end. I'll try to be on time. And what we'll talk about today is remote proctoring, specifically for high-stake tests. And a question which has been coming up lately, are we there yet? So what is remote proctoring, first of all? Normally, in a testing center, tests are proctored or invigilated by people who make sure test takers have everything they need, test conditions meet set standards, and security measures are in place. Tests which have introduced remote proctoring employ a system which invigilates and secures the test remotely. There are two types of remote proctored systems, proctored by AI and proctored by humans in real time. In the first type, AI proctored systems, there's a variety of technological solutions which provide a platform for the test takers, and the test is proctored by AI algorithms, which can be set to detect infractions or red flags, as we call them, depending on the stakes of the test. In the end, a report is sent to a human to review the red flags and make any decisions. In the second type, when it's proctored in real time by humans, a person invigilates. Now, there are obvious advantages to the AI proctored solutions, and there are a few key providers, such as ProctorTrack, ProctorU, Proctorio, Examity, Respondus, Monitor, and many others. Some of the functionalities of the remote proctored systems are lockdown features. For example, test takers are not allowed to open any browsers on their laptops while taking the test. Authentication, a process called onboarding, which basically needs to be completed before the test is taken to authenticate that the person who is taking the test is the actual person. Webcam and integrated microphone and headphones use. Keystroke analytics. This is used as an online biometric authentication system to uniquely identify test takers. And of course, real-time data forensics, which identifies any cheating patterns. Test item security is one of the main indicators of good remote proctored systems, especially for high-stake tests. And of course, privacy and safeguarding for test takers, especially minors. Now, why is remote proctoring making headlines, and why is it important? So the COVID pandemic has forced many organizations around the world to find ways to do operations online. For the language assessment community, this is especially sensitive, as for any assessment solution to be valid and reliable, it needs to ensure security and confidence in the proposed online format. Many organizations around the world adopted measures to be able to assess test takers remotely. Some high-stakes language tests which have done this include TOEFL, the British Council Aptis remote version, Versan, American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, LanguageCert, and others. Remote proctoring provides an array of new solutions to test takers, test administrators, schools and universities, as well as any other stakeholders. Even though the technology has been around for over a decade, the pandemic has accelerated its adoption, and educational institutions around the world have increased their interest. The popularity of remote proctored systems has also been intensified by the technological advancements in the field, and many are looking into the future and the use of computerized tests which can be done at home safely and securely. How can remote proctoring become the future? Technology, as I mentioned, has improved, but more is needed in the field. Scholars agree that more research in remote proctored tests, test takers' attitudes, opinions, and scores is needed if remote proctoring is to be fully adopted. There needs to be clearer understanding of what remote proctored systems exactly do, especially AI proctored ones, and how they can contribute to the overall test taker's experience. Safeguarding, especially when minors are involved, needs to be clearly addressed by organizations. This is the case particularly with AI again, where there's no human in real time invigilating. There are certain limitations which needs to be addressed, such as limited or lack of use of computers and reliable internet connection in certain areas of the world, authentication methods, and privacy. Here is a bit of reference, just a few articles in the field, and just a few more. If anyone is interested in finding out more, you can always send me an email and I'll be happy to send them to you. And thank you very much for your attention. And Chris, I guess I will turn it over to you.
Yep. Thanks so much, Rados, and thanks to everybody for those fascinating presentations. Just to let everyone know, we can actually stay online for another 35 minutes, I believe, so we can have our discussion period now. Like I said earlier, we will prioritize the questions from the audience. So if you do have a question, you can either post it in the chat box or you can raise your hand. I think Zoom has that. So I do have one question from the audience, which was asked earlier. So let me just find that one. Okay, so there's a question earlier. I think the person who is best placed to answer this would be Will, possibly Trevor as well. So the question was about the AI programming, and the question was asked by Michael Berachon, who says, very curious to find out if there are any biases within the AI programming and whether they were noticed by developers. And what examples of biases were there in terms of, for example, types of English?
I think I jumped the gun over there because a lot of that was addressed in the following preceding speakers. But if you want to expand that,
are there any? Would you like any further elaboration? Yeah,
yeah, I think
or Trevor, would you like to?
I think that Cheryl gave a very detailed description of where those biases come from, and I think Jonathan also touched on it in terms of the pictures. It essentially comes down to the data set. What do you train the machine with? So let's say you've got an English test that is based in the United States, but you train your machine with just English of people who were speaking English in, say, the south of India. Obviously, although both of those groups of people are speaking English, the pronunciation of those two groups of people is very different. So the machine would be very good at rating South Indians, but it wouldn't be very good at rating North Americans. So yeah, it all comes down to the data. Trevor, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, just out of interest, for the product that Will was talking about, that's which is the Outsmart Learning, the users are Chinese speakers between ages of, say, 14 and 18. And it was trained on data from Chinese non-natives at the age of 18. And it was trained on literally millions of samples because the data came from the speaking test that's taken by all students when they enter university. We were incredibly lucky. Millions of samples, right age, non-native speaker in Chinese. And that is the same as our test users. That proximity is pretty amazing, to be honest. When you get into an issue that Cheryl just was talking about, which is the idea that you have a product that's global, and therefore you have lots of different accents, you've got lots of different backgrounds, then the pressure on the database is massive, because you need to represent all of that diverse range of users within the training that goes into the machine. So really, data, yes, you need to think about the integrity of the database in relation to the purpose of the test and the users. Thanks.
Yeah, if I may.
Thanks, Cheryl. Yes, yes, of course.
Yes, exactly. Trevor's point about thinking about who the users are and making sure that your data set reflects that, really key. I think though, in terms of sort of what sort of bias is there, and certainly from my perspective, because I'm interested in comprehensibility and I'm interested in English as a lingua franca specifically, the typical bias with spoken language is around accent. So you've got, if you're only using one particular group of raters, whoever they might be, whether they're, you know, US raters or to draw on the example from, you know, an area in South India, you're going to get those people who will maybe prefer or have certain inherent biases towards different accents, and it won't have anything to do with whether they can understand the people or not. So it's trying to get away from that, and one way you can do that is by really opening up the data sets. So you've got samples from all around the world, and you've got raters from all around the world. Another way is to really just think about, I'm using this test in this context, who are the listeners, who are the speakers, and do it that way, because, but yeah, a typical bias is around accent, which accent and intelligibility and comprehensibility are different things. You can still understand someone perfectly, and there have been many tests on this where you can understand someone perfectly, and the raters do understand the person perfectly, but then they still rate them because they didn't really like the accent, or because they associate the accent with some sort of cultural issues or their own biases. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Cheryl. We're going to sort of bring it back now to what was the first presentation, which is one from Jonathan Dixon about summative assessment. So Jonathan, I actually have a question or two for you, if you'd be so kind as to answer. So the first question I would have, Jonathan, is, I mean, something we're all, I suppose, wondering, not just about summative assessment, but about all the kind of technological developments we've seen in the last year. Do you think these changes to summative testing are here to stay? Will they be here after classrooms return to normal?
Good question. You know, in a world where communication tasks, you know, increasingly rely on technology, it makes sense to use technology in the assessment of students, so that we could, you know, get some accurate inferences here about their real world abilities. However, once students return to the classroom, will the use of technology just be discarded and replaced by paper and pencil tests again? You know, or are we going to see a more blended style of assessment where perhaps aspects of online remote testing still remain? Personally, I hope these changes are here to stay, but there are some things we need to do to make sure this happens. So, for example, we need to ensure that all teachers have the knowledge and skills to administer computer-based assessments, and that schools are able to provide their students with the technology required to be able to participate in such assessments. I mean, it depends on the country, depends on the students we're talking about, but that is a very important thing to consider.
Sure, that kind of segues into a question I have for Jan, actually. I mean, Jan's presentation was on related to computer literacy and whether test takers, how much of that test takers need. So Jan, my question for you, sort of following on from the one I asked Jonathan, is, do you think, like, for today's young people, computer literacy is no longer an issue? I should just, before you answer, I should say that I have heard reports that things that we might take for granted, like being able to turn on a computer, like a desktop computer, supposedly is becoming an issue for some people for whom that technology may even be slightly outdated. So what do you think, Anne? Is it at all, computer literacy? Man of few words. Well, does anyone else want to?
Sorry.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, no, you were muted. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Comment.
So yeah, I was going on about like there being this tendency to sort of overstate or overestimate people's computer literacy with the whole notion of digital natives and so on. Of course, you need very specific knowledge that is, that actually is needed for doing a test on a computer, which is very, very basic, just using a keyboard, using a mouse, and that sort of thing. It's just like you say, some of this using a keyboard is already maybe a little bit old. I mean, people might just be using smartphones, using tablets, and not be very much used to using a keyboard. Also, just because people are playing games all day or using social media doesn't mean they're actually used to typing essays on computers. These are not usually the things that people do in their free time, not what I did when I was young, and maybe not what nowadays.
Okay, thanks very much, Jan. Question, Will, I mean, you've spoken about, you took it even further, and you spoke about machines as opposed to just, doing a test on a computer. One thing, Will, that you mentioned that I thought was very interesting is that the kind of symbiotic relationship between humans and machines when it comes to rating. And you said that if there's an outlier, a human might be better placed to rate it. Could you maybe give an example of what an outlier might look like?
So an outlier would be when people are rating a test. Let's say I'm an IELTS examiner and I'm rating the written test. So mostly examinations fall into the bell curve. So you are expecting to get lots of ratings that are in the middle of whatever the distribution is. So in Europe, this distribution is skewed more towards the top end, whereas in Asia, it's skewed more to the middle. The outliers would be those responses that don't really fit into the bell curve. So they're the tricky ones, the ones that are difficult for the examiners to rate. And usually these are also the written essays or the recordings that are very difficult for the machine to rate. Because if you think about the data that's being fed into the machine, usually the data is the center of the bell curve. So there's usually less data at the extremes, which means that because there's more training in the center, the machine will be better at rating those, but at the extremes, it won't be as good. So in terms of that symbiosis that you talk about, there is a possibility that you could get the machine to rate most of the recordings or the essays in the middle, and then you could have humans rate the ones at the extremes, because the humans would likely be better at doing it, whereas the machine could take the brunt of the responses in the center.
Well, here's kind of maybe a mad idea, as Father Ted would say. Do you think there's some way that students or test takers could become aware of these extremes and try to kind of game the system so that their response might be rated by a human if they perceive humans as being fairer to them than computers? I don't know if you want to answer that, Will, or Trevor, perhaps. But I don't know. That's just kind of may not be the case if that actually happens.
Yeah, sure. There is a possibility that. Well, also there might be an issue of perception, because you might find that the students or the candidates would prefer their responses to be rated by a human than a machine. Whereas actually, I think there is some evidence to suggest that the machines have less bias than humans. Going back to what Cheryl was saying about people from a certain place having a bias because of the pronunciation and the accent that people use. Not to do with how intelligible the language actually is. So yeah, it's very interesting point. Trevor, I don't know, do you have anything more to add to that?
It's interesting that you can take it further in terms of accessibility. I mean, what Cheryl was talking about in terms of the challenges can be flipped and turned into advantages. So for example, say one of the problems with rating a global test is that, say, for example, you have a group of raters that are only familiar with their area, then perhaps there will be bias. The typical, you hear stories like, standardized testing where you have Indian raters, for example, that rate samples from a different country they've never seen before, and they'd rate it lower. So that's an example of a problem with human rating that can be solved if you use data in a correct way in auto rating. How? Because you can have multiple models. So for example, you could have the representation of data from one set of Indian raters, another set of Philippine raters or UK raters. You combine those together, and then what you have is something that's actually potentially more representative than one particular group, but could have actually quite a significant bias on a traditional test. So again, the important thing is how you create that set of raters that then trains the machine. It can go both ways. So I see this as an opportunity as well as potentially, well, as Cheryl's mentioned, it's also a source of concern and consequence.
Thanks very much, Trevor and Will. There's a question here from one of the participants from Hi. Two broad questions. We'll focus on one just because of time considerations. But again, this could be for Will, Trevor, or anyone else for that matter. So to what extent can the automated scorer detect test strategies now? So I guess test strategies refer to kind of ways to kind of memorization perhaps being a good example for speaking. But what stage are the automated scorers at with that?
Well, it's actually quite
difficult to start with, but I'd also like Jonathan Dixon to. Oh, sorry.
So I was just going to say very quickly.
Sorry, Will. Do you mind if I take this one because it's exactly.
Sure. Go ahead.
Trevor, are you there? I think you might be on mute.
Sorry, I thought Will was jumping in. Yes, I would just a couple of things on this. First of all, it's like a battle between a hacker and an antivirus software. This is a very simple way of putting it. So basically, get a strategy to beat a machine, and the company will develop a filter to try and identify it. Okay, so you speak quickly. You develop a filter that tries to identify speaking quickly to break the machine. The problem, of course, there's two problems. First of all, it's difficult to have an antivirus software which is 100%. That's one problem. The other problem is that the vendors do not share this. We're lucky within the British Council in that we work in this region. We work with vendors, and we work with very ethical and leading AI scientists. So we're getting more information. However, it is difficult for us to share it as well because of certain confidentiality clauses we need to sign. And so sometimes it's very difficult for teachers to know how good systems are at identifying cheating and gamification. Jonathan Dixon has just done some interesting research about PTE. I don't know if we can name names, but this isn't actually about the test, but it's about what happens around that test. I don't know if you wanted to discuss any of that, Jonathan.
Yeah, hey, Trevor. So I was looking into some of the latest tips and tricks for passing the PTE academic test, and it is interesting what you did mention, actually, that some of the tricks that might have been mentioned 2-3 years ago, like increased speech rate, those kind of tips don't appear as much now. Actually, the opposite. There's quite a few tips that say make sure you speak slowly and clearly, which kind of goes against increased speech rate. Nowadays, it seems to be a lot of the tips and trick sites are talking about fewer pauses, so speaking continuously without pausing, and that kind of moves on to things like whatever you do, don't try and repeat words or self-correct sentences, which may lead to pausing. Just keep speaking until you complete the sentence. Do not stop halfway through. So this seems to be like a really, really big focus now on some of the websites I've been reading.
Thanks,
And it
Jonathan.
makes sense for them to do that, because the problem.
Go ahead, Trevor.
Sorry, Chris. I was just going to say that it's interesting that that's still a technique, because, as I mentioned in my presentation, it's very difficult for machines to know what is a positive space, hesitation, pause, or one that is caused as a result of disfluency related to content or language. So actually having continuous speech is still recognized as a good way to try and beat the machine. So I'm not surprised to see that tip still out there.
Thanks for that. So I'm just going to move on to Cheryl, because Cheryl also spoke about how, while we might think of all the positives involved in assessing speech sort of automatically, I mean, there's also the ELF consideration where there may be a certain bias towards a certain kind of accent. So Cheryl, you mentioned that, I mean, some companies, I mean, are focusing more on comprehensibility when they're assessing English language pronunciation. So how optimistic would you be, Cheryl, about the future of ELF, English as a lingua franca, in automated assessment?
Good question, Chris. I think the, excuse me, I would like to be very optimistic, because I think it's incredibly important for what we do. So, I mean, I think the way English is used now is completely, it's got nothing to do with native speakers. So I think we need to really guard against going, let me rephrase that. It doesn't have nothing to do with native speakers, but a lot of the English conversations that go on in the world, and certainly this has been, that research has shown this, has been, the conversations are between non-native speakers of English. And so I think we need to bear that in mind, because I think it will have extraordinary consequences for people. So we really need to guard against that. I would also say that, I mean, if I were, if you have someone who is learning English in addition to becoming professional in their job, it's one thing if they're learning it to be able to communicate with great clarity about their work, but it's another thing if they're expected to put in lots of time to modify their accent to start sounding like someone else, because it's not attainable, and it's not, there's just no point to it. Although there are a lot of accent modification programs around the world, and certainly, why should someone spend that much time trying to change something for absolutely no reason at all? So I'm hopeful, but I really think we need to be talking about it as educators, as language educators, as language assessors, because if we don't, it could just be expedience. We're looking for the quickest solution to automated assessment. So let's just move in that direction without really considering the issues. And Trevor did make a good point about, there is, we could flip it, we could look at it as in a positive way, that if we're using the right data sets. And so, understanding what data we're putting in and being very, very vigilant about what data big companies are using, I think is going to be key to making sure that we can continue to reflect English as a lingua franca. And just because you might speak English as a native speaker, don't forget that we're not even talking about native speakers in general. We're speaking about very, very few varieties. So if you have any dialect whatsoever, the good example was the Irish vet, then you are probably going to score quite badly, particularly on the pronunciation aspect. So it's in everyone's interests. Sorry, that was a bit waffly. Hope it makes sense.
No, it's very, very interesting. And I mean, it's trying to predict the future, I guess, is, some people would say, is a fool's errand, but it's something that we inevitably have to consider. Another example of trying to predict the future is with visual literacy. So this is my attempt to sort of segue into Jonathan Cruz's presentation about visual literacy. I think for me, I think I see huge potential in developing, say, visual assessment literacy. I mean, there's a big emphasis on equipping teachers with assessment literacy now. So Jonathan, Do you see that becoming much more of a requirement in the years ahead, whereby teachers may need to be more literate when it comes to visual assessment, or is it kind of maybe a flash in the pan? What would you think?
Well, it's a good question. Thank you, Chris. I don't necessarily think teachers who are practicing in the classroom are not visually literate. I think outside in the education field, I think practicing teachers are actually much more visually literate than pretty much any, because they have to be. I mean, in terms of presentation, I think it's the test developers really that need to have a long, hard look at themselves in terms of developing the test so that, you know, it fits in with whatever kind of skills or constructs they're trying to get from a test taker. If teachers need to do anything, I think if they're creating their own tests, they need to think very carefully about, you know, the training they've got as teachers in terms of using visuals to get the kind of stimulus that they need, you know, stimuli they need from the student. Otherwise, and that's the thing. I mean, Cheryl was just talking about expediency. A lot of tests are basically bunged together, you know, and bunging tests together or just putting them together and saying, oh, well, this will do or this will do. That's the problem, really. It's the consideration. And I don't think, you know, if you're a teacher, often you rely on other people's tests. But if you create your own tests, you have to really be careful about what you're doing in terms of just saying what kind of content and what kind of skills you're trying to test. So that's essentially it. And this is, you know, as sort of like big data becomes an issue and you're feeding machines that do automated assessment and they're looking at basically what is being tested and they're drawing the constructs out, there's the issue, because then it becomes exponentially difficult. If you see what I mean, you know, sure. It becomes exponentially problematic, I should say. You know.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think just to kind of broaden it even further, I mean, what is the future of technology when it comes to language assessment? I mean, is there any role for, I mean, we keep emphasizing that it'll be sort of a symbiotic role, but, and this is a question, by the way, for everybody. Looking 10 years ahead, oh no, John, you can still answer if you want, but looking 10, 20 years ahead, where will we be in terms of technology and language assessment? Let's try to hazard a guess here. I think Rados skill as well.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Yeah. That's okay. We'll get back to you. But Rados and Neil, because I don't want to leave you out. I mean, what do you guys think about the future of technology and language assessment? Is it not just in relation to your areas, but more generally?
I honestly think it's the future. I mean, I think we're going to be seeing more and more technology in remote tests, exams, possibly using more machines for scoring. It doesn't necessarily mean that this will replace humans. I don't think so, because I think we still need people to score, to provide, to feed the machine, to train the machine, as Trevor and Will had talked about. We also need people to, even if it's AI remotely proctored system, we still need people to watch for safeguarding. We haven't gotten around that issue yet, and to watch for any red flags. So I think, I think we'll still need people, but we'll see more and more technology and assessment, for which I'm excited.
Me too. Neil, are you as excited about that when it comes to, say, VCS? Because, you know, I guess a lot of examiners are probably hopeful of the day where they can examine while, you know, wearing shorts, but, you know, kind of a collared shirt and tie, you know, above. Is that something that's really in the future of examiners, or will there still be the kind of face-to-face, you know, tests in a variety of test centers? You know,
I imagine there'll still be some face-to-face, but I think part of the thing that's driving, besides the COVID issue that's driving VCS, is just as it expands the reach of the tests out of places that are more difficult for examiners to get to. So, you know, obviously in China, usually we just visit provincial capitals to do face-to-face tests. But if you have VCS as an option, you might still have like human examiners doing the testing, but you don't have to have the candidates travel, you know, 4 or 5 hours into one center. So I think there's going to be there's that kind of demand for the growth of video testing, but I still think you want to have people at the other end of it for a speaking test.
Yeah, I mean, I know at British Council we're quite concerned, as a lot of companies are in a lot of industries, about reducing our carbon footprint, and it seems something like VCS would have a lot of potential there. So does anyone else have any kind of views on that, about how technology might be kind of driven along even faster because of this need to reduce one's carbon footprint? Cheryl, I think you might have something to say about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and it's something I've been reading up on really recently. And I think that it's very tempting, and I certainly VCS definitely will, the IELTS VCS will definitely reduce carbon footprint, because you're not having people travel to face-to-face tests anymore. But I think one thing you need to be really careful about, and this is, again, I quoted Timnit Gebru in my presentation, and she has highlighted the enormous carbon footprint that big data brings with it. So it's tempting to think, oh, well, if we just go automated, everything's going to be great. But the carbon footprint of actually all the computers that are used to generate this machine learning is huge. And also the social implications, you know, for all the computer hardware, the batteries and the battery life and everything else. You know, there are sort of children in mines in poverty-stricken countries. So, you know, I think it's really tempting to think that this is a panacea in terms of what we can, where we can go in the future. I'm just not sure it is. But again, coming back to a point that Jonathan emphasized, we really just need to consider all the angles. We shouldn't just view it as a panacea and a silver bullet, and that's
yeah,
that's the solution to all.
Who knows, we might even be able to 3D print test centers in the future, you know, which is another thing to consider, you know. But of course, everything comes with trade-offs. You know, that's a very important point to mention. Does anybody have anything else to add to that about the future of language assessment? What is there anything? So Will, go ahead.
Yeah, I have something to add, and I would say that I see the future involving humans, and the reason for that is a question of resources, because as Cheryl described and Trevor, when you have all of these different communities of practice, all of these different people who are using English in different ways, if you wanted to flatten the curve that I was talking about earlier and have a data set which covers every different kind of English from all over the world, you're talking about an unbelievably huge data set. For example, the GPT-3 engine, which is this engine which is famous for having written a Guardian newspaper article, and nobody noticed that it was written by a computer. It can finish novels. But to train that engine, you're talking tens of millions of dollars worth of supercomputer time and an unbelievably massive data set to do that. Whereas I don't think that the companies that put together language assessments have those kinds of resources. So it makes much more sense to have a much more narrow engine that can't cover all of those bases, but still use humans for the difficult cases. For example, the Irish vet in Australia. I suppose the trick is making sure that the machine can spot the outlier so that someone like that woman isn't embarrassed and still brought up 15 years later.
And yeah, I just thinking about it then in terms of, sorry, Cheryl, go ahead.
Sorry, I said it's not the most recent case, but it's not quite 15 years, but yes, good point. Well,
I think we're almost out of time. I just have one final question, which anybody is welcome to answer. Fastest finger first, as it were. So, do you think technology, as it pertains to language assessment, is ultimately going to make teachers' lives easier or more complicated?
I think in the long run, it's going to be a lot easier. Oh, sorry. Carry on, Trevor.
Trevor, yeah. And we can all give quick fire answers if we want.
Yeah, a lot easier. Basically, it's going to free up.
It will be easier.
Carry on.
No, you could do.
He's cracking up. That time of the evening. So I think you both think it'll be easier. Anybody else? Any
Yeah.
outliers among you who think, you know, this might actually be trickier? I think we can all. I think we can all pretty much agree. Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. Michael Fried just says it's more complicated because admin will find new ways to bungle things up. Yeah, that's the kind of cynicism that sets in after years in ESL. I think certainly it has for me anyway. But yeah, getting too old. I think yeah, that probably brings us to the end now. Really, I know we can continue the discussion in what's it called again, Michael? You sent a link to. Where is it? Yeah, yeah. There's a place we can continue the discussion in Discord. Yes. So we might head over there if anyone has any other questions or if we want to add anything more to the discussions we've had. But I think that brings us to the end. It's been a marathon 2 hours. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It's early for me, but very late for most of you. So if you're in Korea, you might be hitting the makgeolli or the soju about now. I'm going to make something very boring and have some soup for lunch. So thanks everyone else for your attendance, and thanks to my team for participating. Back to you, Michael.
All right, good. Go to Discord if you like. If you don't want to go to Discord and you want to have your soup, that's fine. Your homework for the evening is to go watch So I Married an Axe Murderer, or if you've only got a bit of time, go look up the Frostbit Lad from Northern Ireland.
Great video. Great video.
Lovely chat. Well. All right, thank you all for coming. I'm going to bed. See you later.
Yeah.
Cheers, Michael. Thanks again, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Night. And good luck.